This is the story of the Philippines during World War II. A tale of invasion, resistance, liberation, and the birth of a nation. In the early 1940s, the Philippines stood at a crossroads of history. A jewel of the Pacific, this archipelago of over 7,000 islands had been under American colonial rule since the turn of the century. But the winds of change were blowing, carrying with them both the promise of independence and the threat of war. Manila, the capital, was known as the Pearl of the Orient, a bustling metropolis where Art Deco buildings stood alongside Spanish colonial architecture. The country's economy was growing, fueled by exports of sugar, copra, and other agricultural products. But the Philippines was also a fortress. Its strategic location made it a linchpin in America's defense of the Pacific. U.S. military bases dotted the islands, and the Philippine Army trained alongside American forces, preparing for a future as an independent nation. Little did they know that their path to freedom would soon be interrupted by one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. As Japan's empire expanded across Asia, the Philippines found itself in the crosshairs of imperial ambition. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, drawing the United States into World War II. But Pearl Harbor was just the beginning. Within hours, Japanese forces struck targets across the Pacific, including the Philippines. On December 8th, Japanese bombers appeared in the skies over Manila, marking the beginning of a campaign that would reshape the destiny of the Philippine nation. The invasion caught the defenders off guard. Despite months of war preparations, the combined Filipino and American forces were overwhelmed by the speed and ferocity of the Japanese assault. Over the next few months, the Japanese pushed the defenders back, forcing a retreat to the Bataan Peninsula and the island fortress of Corregidor. In Bataan, soldiers and civilians alike endured months of siege, facing not only the relentless Japanese attacks, but also the ravages of disease and starvation. Their bravery and sacrifice bought precious time for Allied forces elsewhere, but at a terrible cost. On April 9, 1942, Bataan fell to the Japanese. What followed would become one of the most infamous episodes of the war. The Bataan Death March forced some 75,000 Filipino and American prisoners of war to march over 60 miles in tropical heat with little food or water. Thousands died along the way, victims of exhaustion, disease, and brutal treatment by their captors. Corregidor, the last bastion of Allied resistance in the Philippines, held out for another month. But on May 6, 1942, it too fell to the Japanese. With the fall of Corregidor in May 1942, the Philippines entered a new and challenging era. The Japanese occupation would last for 3 years, reshaping Filipino society and testing the resolve of its people. The occupiers wasted no time in implementing their vision of a co-prosperity sphere in Southeast Asia. Their goal was to remake the Philippines in Japan's image, erasing centuries of Western influence. On October 14, 1943, the Japanese established the Second Philippine Republic with Jose P. Laurel as its president. This puppet government was meant to give a veneer of Filipino autonomy, but in reality, it answered directly to Tokyo. For ordinary Filipinos, life under occupation was a daily struggle. The economy, once thriving, was now entirely geared towards supporting the Japanese war effort. Rice and other staples were strictly rationed, leading to widespread hunger and malnutrition. The occupiers also launched a campaign of cultural change. Japanese language classes became mandatory in schools, Western books were banned, and Japanese-approved literature took their place. Many Filipinos were conscripted for forced labor, working on Japanese military projects under harsh conditions. Women faced the constant threat of sexual violence, with many forced into sexual slavery as comfort women for Japanese soldiers. But even in these dark times, the spirit of the Filipino people remained unbroken. Resistance to Japanese rule took many forms. In the countryside, guerrilla groups formed, often led by American and Filipino soldiers who had escaped capture. These fighters harassed Japanese forces, gathered intelligence, and kept hope alive for eventual liberation. In the cities, resistance often took more subtle forms. Underground newspapers circulated, keeping people informed of Allied progress in the war. Ordinary citizens engaged in small acts of sabotage and disobedience, undermining the occupation at every turn. By 1944, large swaths of the Philippine countryside were effectively under guerrilla control. These brave men and women would play a crucial role in the coming liberation of their homeland. As the tide of war in the Pacific began to turn, Filipinos clung to the promise made by General Douglas MacArthur when he was forced to leave Corregidor. "I shall return." By 1944, the tide of war in the Pacific had turned. American forces, having fought their way across the ocean, were now poised to fulfill General MacArthur's promise to return to the Philippines. The liberation of the Philippines began on October 20th, 1944, with landings on the island of Leyte. It would be the start of a campaign that would last until the war's end in August 1945. In one of the war's most iconic moments, General Douglas MacArthur waded ashore on Leyte, declaring to the Filipino people, "I have returned." His words electrified the nation and signaled the beginning of the end for Japanese occupation. The return to the Philippines was marked by some of the largest naval battles in history. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought from October 23rd, 26, saw the decisive defeat of the Japanese Navy, effectively ending its role as a strategic force in the Pacific. As American forces advanced, they were joined by tens of thousands of Filipino guerrillas. These resistance fighters provided crucial intelligence, guided American troops through unfamiliar terrain, and fought bravely alongside their allies. Island by island, province by province, the Philippines was gradually liberated. But the fighting was fierce and the cost in lives and destruction was high. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Battle of Manila in February 1945. In 1 month of intense urban combat, much of the historic capital was reduced to rubble. Thousands of civilians were caught in the crossfire or deliberately killed by retreating Japanese forces. Despite the hardships, the liberation was met with jubilation by most Filipinos. After 3 long years of occupation, freedom was finally within reach. On September 2nd, 1945, Japan formally surrendered, bringing World War II to an end. For the Philippines, it marked the end of colonial rule and foreign occupation. The partnership between Filipino and American forces during the liberation campaign had reaffirmed the deep ties between the two nations, but it had also demonstrated the Philippines' readiness to stand as an independent nation. As the dust of war settled, the Philippines faced the daunting task of rebuilding a nation shattered by years of conflict. The cost of liberation had been high, and the scars of war were visible everywhere. The Philippines had suffered greatly. An estimated 1 million Filipinos had died during the war and occupation. Manila, once the Pearl of the Orient, lay in ruins, with much of its historic architecture reduced to rubble. The economy was in shambles. Agricultural lands had been ravaged, industries destroyed, and the nation's infrastructure lay in tatters. The Philippines faced the monumental task of reconstructing its economy almost from scratch. Millions were left homeless, with refugee camps springing up across the country. Families torn apart by war struggled to reunite, while others mourned loved ones who would never return. The United States, recognizing its responsibility to its former colony, initiated substantial aid programs. The Philippine Rehabilitation Act of 1946 promised $620 million in direct aid and war damage compensation. Despite the challenges, the Filipino people demonstrated remarkable resilience. Communities came together to clear the rubble and rebuild their homes and livelihoods. The spirit of bayanihan, communal unity and cooperation, was evident everywhere. Even as the Philippines rebuilt, its leaders prepared for the long-awaited transition to independence, promised by the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934. The United States remained committed to this promise despite the intervening years of war and occupation. In April 1946, the Philippines held its first post-war presidential election, with Manuel Roxas emerging victorious. On July 4, 1946, the dream of generations became reality. In a ceremony in Manila, the American flag was lowered and the flag of the Philippines was raised. Thank you for joining us on History Watch as we explore the pivotal moments that define our past. Remember to subscribe and hit the bell icon to discover more histories each week.